Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are very pleased this evening to welcome Nathaniel Rich to campus for a discussion of his story, Losing Earth, the Decade That We Almost Stopped Climate Change, which was an entire issue of the New York Times Magazine this summer. We look forward to his conversation with Dr. Kim Wolski of the Harris School. George Steinmetz, who took the incomparable photos behind you that accompanied the story, was supposed to be with us, sends his regrets. He got called off on assignment. I do want to thank our partners on this event, the Pulitzer Center. UChicago and the IOP are proud to be key partners in the center's campus consortium network of more than 30 universities and colleges around the country. I did want to briefly mention a few upcoming events. Tomorrow at lunch, David Axelrod will be interviewing the legendary Doris Kearns Goodwin about her new book on presidential leadership. That conversation is UChicago students, faculty, and staff only. Thursday, Caitlin Huey Burns will be talking with IOP fellows and former Congressmen Tom Davis and Steve Israel to give us a preview of the midterm elections. And in 2 weeks, we are pleased to be hosting Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia. You can find out more about these and other events at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. A quick word about voting. There are elections coming up in 1 week, and we at the IOP believe that that voting is the most fundamental responsibility and privilege that we all enjoy in our democracy. This fall, a group of students called UChi Votes have launched a nonpartisan push to boost turnout on campus. So if you want to make sure that you're registered, find out early voting dates in any state, or find a nearby polling place, check out their website at uchivotes.com. The nearest polling place where you can vote starting tomorrow early on campus is going to be at Reynolds Club right across the street. It will be open tomorrow through Friday, 10 to 5 each day. We really hope to see as many folks as we can. And for more information, again, you can go to uchivotes.com. We will have questions at the end of the conversation from the audience. So during the conversation, please make a note of anything that you want to ask about. We're going to have microphones on both sides of the seats. And as usual, we give priority for the first 3 questions to students. And we remind you that questions end in a question mark. Please make sure that your phones are on silent. And now to formally welcome and introduce our guests is Dylan Wells. Dylan is a 4th year studying political science. During her time at UChicago, she has served as editor-in-chief of The Gate, which is the IOP's undergraduate political review. And this year, she is the communications chair for our student advisory board, and she is the amazing force behind a lot of the communications on UChi Votes, and we're very grateful to her for her service. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Excuse me. Thank you all for coming. Nathaniel Rich is a writer at large for the New York Times Magazine and the author of 3 books, with a 4th due to be released in January. His work regularly appears in The Atlantic and the New York Review of Books, and he served as the fiction editor of the Paris Review. His work has been a finalist for the Best American Magazine Award for Fiction, and he's written about topics ranging from free climbing and lottery winners to cults and Amanda Knox. This conversation will be moderated by Dr. Kim Wolski, research associate and assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy and fellow with EPIC, the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. Wolski studies the behavioral elements of energy issues and has researched how framing climate change can influence public support for climate change mitigation. She has previously worked with the URB Institute for Global Sustainable Enterprise and O-Power. This evening, Rich and Wolski will discuss Rich's in-depth feature, Losing Earth, the Decade We Almost Stopped Climate Change. The article was produced over the course of 18 months and involved over 100 interviews. The piece was released as a special entire edition of the New York Times Magazine, and it was produced with the support of the Pulitzer Center. The article garnered high praise for its in-depth look at the different activists, scientists, and politicians who dedicated their entire careers to stopping climate change, and Apple has optioned the story for TV development. Rich's work was released alongside the incredible photos and videos by George Steinmetz, some of which you see at the back of the room today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Rich and Professor Wolski.
Thank you, Dylan, for that introduction. And I have to say, I'm very excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this for the past month. I want to start broad and sort of ask, what was your motivation for doing the story? Why focus on a decade from 30 years ago?
So the Times magazine, my editors approached me more than a couple years ago now and asked if I would like to write a piece that would be the entire issue of a magazine. And I said yes.
Hard to turn it down.
What's it going to be about? Yeah. And the Pulitzer Center had done this once before with a piece a couple years earlier about the Middle East by Scott Anderson, and they wanted to do something about climate change. And it's a subject that I've written about and am interested, fascinated, obsessed with. And the challenge immediately, I guess it was two-pronged. One was, how do you write, what story is worth an entire issue of a magazine? It's essentially, the assignment was at 30 to 40,000 words, which is basically a short book, and about more than 4 times the length of a typical cover story. And so, what story merits that approach, and the time that would be necessary to produce that, but more importantly, what was an original way to write and think about climate change? And there I felt like we had a huge opening because I've felt for a long time that so much of the writing about the subject falls into the same kind of patterns and cliches as you see with a lot of subjects, but I think especially, unfortunately, when it comes to climate change, in that we tend to hear about the political story, certainly the scientific story, the environmental story, and the industry story, and those are all crucial to understanding how we got to where we are and where, and what's going to happen next. But I always felt it left out the most important dimension of it, which is the human story, and that this is a story about the great existential threat that we face as a civilization. It's one that we've brought upon ourselves as a species. It's one that we're all complicit in if we use electricity. And I don't think we talk about it in an honest way, frankly. Whether you're, putting aside, of course, denialists and the sort of fever dream of that, I think even people who care about the issue and work towards it, I find so much of the writing about it to be very narrow. And so we felt that by going back in time and going to this period from 79 to 1989, which is when the piece is set, it offered us an opening into the heart of the matter, because in this period, the issue hadn't been politicized, certainly not anything resembling the extent that it is today, and there was a real opening for policy. Oil and gas industry hadn't coordinated this sort of vicious multi-decade campaign that ended with denialism, and we knew the science. We understood it perfectly by 1979. So, and there was a pivot in 1979 from sort of the science to policy, and so and then it was a positive trajectory for most, with some ups and downs, leading up to the negotiation of what would become the first IPCC treaty, and we came within a couple of signatures of what was then going to be a binding global treaty to reduce emissions, and we failed. So I wanted to understand why we failed, but even more than that, get into ask some of these more difficult questions about how we struggle with this problem, independently of all of the politics and everything that comes out of that.
It's funny you say it's a bunch of ups and downs. I felt like I was on a roller coaster reading the story, even though I had a sense of how it was going to end. There were these moments of, oh, there seems to be momentum, something good is going to happen, and then there's sort of a backslide or a crash, and it's kind of starting back over what's the next movement. And can you kind of walk us through what were the pivotal events in 1979? Because as you say, we already knew the science of climate change. In fact, since before 1900, we had this idea that humans could alter the climate by burning fossil fuels. So what made 1979 different from, say, previous scientific reports back in the 50s and 60s?
Right. And that's, I'll answer that question, but I am interested to hear that your reading of it as sort of ups and downs, because that's how that's sort of how the story actually progressed, and that's how I saw the story. But then one of the main editorial conversations I had with my editors was about the degree to which we should highlight or discuss at length the sort of low points within this decade, because there was a fear, I think, on the part of the editors that because readers today are so aware of our failure, that any suggestion that things weren't going well during this period might reinforce a kind of a bias that a contemporary reader would bring to it that, oh, of course this couldn't have ever worked.
Right.
Anyway, this is something I've just been thinking about a lot now, because I'm turning it into a book, and I'm kind of going back to my original idea of a kind of, essentially there's 3 acts. At the beginning, the science in 1979, the basic mechanism of warming and why CO2 and burning fossil fuels increases warming, and why that will have negative effects. Well, the first part of that was established by, as you said, the late 19th century. By the middle of the 20th century, there's the first awareness that, yes, these warming effects are happening, and it might not be a good thing, because the first scientists who were studying it were in London and Stockholm, and they thought, well, maybe if things are a little warmer, it might not be so bad. By the mid-50s, you have Roger Revelle and Hans Suess saying, well, our entire economy and our society is based around very specific climate conditions that if they alter in any direction, this is going to be extremely destabilizing. And you have warnings throughout, and you have intelligence community memos, and you have every president starting at least by Kennedy thinking about the issue, debating whether they should do anything. By 1979, you have these major consensus reports by the kind of the highest levels of the scientific brass within Washington, D.C., which at the time, this is another sort of contextual thing that's hard to explain, is that scientists within the government, elite scientists within the government, had extremely high status then, which seems fantastical now. But they were kinds of like high priests of policy, and that's a tradition that started in the Manhattan Project and basically went up until Reagan. So they said, this is happening, this is serious, we need to act, and the degree of certainty about the projections had narrowed to, in the words of the Charney report, which was the major report that kind of validated all of the other reports and still stands as the prediction. 1.5 to 4.5 degrees warming, 3 degrees warming likely, and that's 3 Celsius over industrial age since the Industrial Revolution. And that was kind of the end of the major science. I mean, then you have the first conversations about policy, and by late 79, early 80, Congress is asking experts to try to devise climate legislation, and so the ball starts rolling. And so the first part of the piece is basically a couple of people, a scientist, Jim Hansen, NASA scientist who's studying this, Rave Pomerance, who's a kind of political lobbyist, environmental activist hybrid. He finds out about this issue, and they think at first, well, surely if we just tell enough people in power about what's happening, that our species is facing an existential threat, surely they will act. That doesn't work.
Right.
and then should I go through the rest of it, or is it?
Well,
yeah.
let's pause there, because
Yeah.
I think Rave Pomerance has a really important role, or at least that's my perception. He's sort of a central character throughout this decade, and I don't know if you focus on him because it's a convenient character, or if there's something really unique about him in comparison to the rest of this, where the environmental movement was.
Extremely convenient character when I met him, because I was looking for people to base this story around. I felt it was very important for it to be a human story and to have human characters that you follow throughout this. And I knew Jim Hansen would have to be one of them. But Rave Pomerance is this extremely charismatic. Sorry, this gentleman here kind of looks like Rave Pomerance. I'm having like, is he spying? Is he here? Yeah, extremely charismatic, attractive guy who is from this, on both sides, this very established political family, going back to the turn of the century, and was a labor rights organizer, then worked on the Clean Air Act for Friends of the Earth. So really at the heart of the 70s environmental movement. Friends of the Earth was founded by David Brower from the Sierra Club. And so he was politically connected and environmentally conscious. And the other thing, and he also, as I learned from almost instantly after I met him, even though very little had been written about him, and he's written very little, he sort of stays out of the spotlight, he basically single-handedly drove the issue for the entire decade. And so he was kind of like, almost like a Forrest Gumpian type role, is that he was there at every stage, but also he was pushing it throughout. And so, and the other key thing about him is he's basically the only environmentalist who cared about the issue for the entire decade. So we talk about, why wasn't action taken, why wasn't pressure put on, politicians and stuff during this time? Well, part of it is because the environmental community didn't know how to deal with this problem, and it wasn't a priority for them. And that doesn't really change until the end of the decade, although you can see a couple mentions of the issue in the 70s and through the 80s. He was single-handedly pushing it, and I think he was, and I asked him many times, a version of the question of, did it seem crazy to you that other environmentalists didn't care about this issue for all of this time when you were screaming from the rooftops about it? And he basically said, yeah. And from the benefit of hindsight, like, it does seem crazy. But the movement was very different, and the politics were very different, and the way that environmentalist groups, raised money and the form their activism took was a very different model that didn't easily adjust itself to a problem like CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere.
And there were also moments, though, where people, scientists in positions of power, are sort of saying we don't need to be worried. You mentioned the Charney report, but there was also, 500-page report, Changing Climate, is that what it's called, by National Academy of Sciences, that outlined all of the very bad things that would happen if CO2 emissions continued to climb. And can you tell us sort of how that got shared with the public?
Yeah, so Changing Climate report was a report published by the National Academy of Sciences. So it's the sort of the most august scientific body in the country. And they took on the issue, and the idea was to do the first fully comprehensive report about climate change. So that meant not just the science, the projections for the future, but the geopolitical ramifications, the economic ramifications, the social ramifications. And they enlisted like 100 experts from various different fields, not just earth scientists, but economists, and William Nordhaus was on the committee, basically every big name. Thomas Schelling, one of the architects of game theory. And they all wrote this big report and released it at this kind of dress-up ball in the National Academy, and the chair of the committee was a guy named William Nierenberg, who was a Manhattan Project veteran, Republican, Southern California, had replaced Roger Revelle at Scripps, the premier oceanographic institute. And he, in speaking about it, basically said, yes, this seems like a serious problem, but we will be able to solve it eventually. The suggestion was through technology. We've solved lots of other problems. We've invented the nuclear bomb and so on. And he gets blamed, rightly, for basically destroying the momentum from 79 to 83. That kind of stops the issue dead politically for the next 5 years. Because essentially the full authority of the government has been brought to bear by saying this is urging caution, not panic. So he gets blamed for this, and there's some conspiratorial thinking about why he came to that conclusion, which we can also talk about, but it wasn't just him. It was also Roger Revelle, who was the person who first sounded the alarm in 1957. He said this exact same thing in the press statements. It was Thomas Schelling, the Cold War Nobel laureate. It was basically everyone in this class of elder scientists, esteemed elder scientists, all came to this conclusion, and it drove people like Rave Pomerance crazy because they did not have the same kind of faith and confidence that scientists would solve this problem or that governments would be able to solve this problem.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize that he wasn't the only one, but that several scientists had those statements. My read from the article is that the momentum sort of died down, and then of all things, it was the ozone hole that sort of brought attention back to climate change. And in reading about the ozone hole, it seems to be both sort of a blessing and a curse. A blessing maybe in the short term that it's bringing attention to the issue, but long term maybe potentially causing problems in terms of confusion between the two issues. And if anything, maybe even competing a little bit for policy attention. And I'm curious, since you are a writer and a novelist, a lot of the success around the ozone hole has been credited to the narrative. And I think you say, I'm going to paraphrase you, but there is no ozone layer, there is no hole. It's just a weakening of, I'm doing a bad job of explaining this, it's a thinner layer of ozone that explains it, but having that imagery of as an ozone hole really captured the imaginations of the public. And how did we fail then in talking about climate change, which at the time was often referred to as greenhouse effect? Where do you see where we may have misstepped in describing that problem?
Well, part of the issue is they have the solutions are very different. So the ozone hole was caused by CFC emissions, most of which were produced by one company, DuPont. And DuPont resisted. They made the same arguments in the early 80s that would sound familiar to anyone who follows climate change. The science is uncertain. It's not so bad. There's no direct evidence that this is what's causing it, and so on. But then when the ozone hole terminology came along, they were basically just overwhelmed. That's part of it. And then the other thing is they figured out they could profit off of making the replacement chemicals. And so they did a 180 and then were lobbying for a major global treaty. With CO2, the solution is changing our entire energy use. And that affects every single person on the planet, and it drives every economy. So it's a bit of a different problem. That said, there was pretty widespread agreement, not only within sort of policy circles and environmental circles, but also within industry, that this was the trajectory that the CO2 issue was going to follow. And it was a very clear path. It was, we're scared about the problem, and that happens in '88 with James Hansen's testimony before Congress, saying climate change global warming is here now, it's happening during the hottest summer ever. Then you have international meetings, you have a UN-led process, and leading up to a binding global treaty. And in fact, that is what happened. And if you look at internal memos and things from Exxon in '88, '89, they say this is where this is going, and it's just important that when these laws are passed, when these regulations are passed, that we make sure that they don't overwhelm us, basically, that it's not, that they don't hurt our profits, and that they're responsible from an oil industry perspective. So that's the beginning of where the industry turns, but basically even the industry was more optimistic about that the solution was going to happen than I think they had reason to be.
Can you talk more about the fossil fuel industry? It's kind of interesting. At the beginning of the article, you actually say that we can't blame the fossil fuel industry or the Republican Party. And I think that's a conclusion that maybe is hard for some readers to wrestle with, because in reading the story, especially with the fossil fuel industry, they knew about it well before 1979. They took action, started funding research, saw that it was a priority, and then when that study came out and Nuremberg says we don't need to worry, they kind of stopped their efforts. But
well, I guess I would dispute that reading of that passage in the introduction, because in the context of where those sentences are written, it's the reason we failed during the 1980s cannot be blamed on the Republican Party, on the oil and gas industry, but I think I make very clear that since 1989, it's a very different calculus, and of course you can blame the Republican Party, and of course you can blame the oil and gas industry. My point was simply that during the 80s, certainly there were Republicans who were not helpful, and Reagan was horrible on the environment, and all of that, but you do have major leading senators on the Republican side. You have the head of the EPA under George H.W. Bush. You have George H.W. Bush himself campaigning that he's going to solve the greenhouse effect. You have Jim Baker. You have all these major figures within the party who are supportive of a policy, and you have an industry that hasn't pivoted as they did right after, beginning after Hanson's testimony. So I'm not saying that we can't blame climate anything on the industry or the Republican Party. It's just that the story of this decade is more complicated than the narratives that we use to talk about what's happened since, which is basically decades of propaganda, funding of scientists to tell lies, and all of that, which I think we know about. Yeah.
I mean, I guess the counter argument is that's a more blatant counter movement that we've seen in the last several decades, but the fossil fuel industry was aware of the impact their industry was having, and then chose to take a back seat in 1983 when it didn't seem like the government was going to see this as a major issue.
Yeah, so the fossil fuel industry ignored it, just as the environmentalists did, and just as the auto industry did, and just as the electric grid did, and just as the federal government did, and you could also say just as the American people did. This was not secret stuff. This was out there, and if the oil and gas industry were good corporate citizens, they might have led the charge. That would have been great. And they're not morally blameless for not doing, for failing to do that. But to simplify it and say that because they knew and didn't take action on policy during the 1980s, that's the reason why we failed in 1989 and dropped out of the climate accord, I don't think you can stand any scrutiny. Yeah, but I think it's interesting. You can certainly blame them post '89, as I do, and I tell the story of how that pivot happened. But they're not, they're not morally, they're not good Samaritans. No one's saying that. But I think we failed without them. Even before they got involved, we failed first.
So that's actually an interesting phrase, and one I think has gotten a lot of reaction, this idea of this is the decade that we failed to solve or stop climate change. And there have been, I guess, some negative reactions to this idea of the collective we, that we have this collective responsibility. And it's interesting you mentioned the public knowing about this, but I think that's maybe not quite fair to the public, because if you look at public opinion polls, there was awareness. Have you heard of the greenhouse effect? But there was a lot of confusion too, of conflating climate change with the ozone hole or with air pollution in general, and people not having a really good understanding of causes and effects. So I know, I as a reader and someone who was very interested in environmental issues in the 80s, climate change was not a topic that came to the dinner room table. I could tell you all about tropical deforestation and the ozone hole, but it wasn't something that I think was on the collective conscience. So I guess could you explain a little bit more the we part of this? Because I think it is easy for a reader to come away saying there are these certain institutions that still bear responsibility because they had a better understanding of it and had the capacity to do something.
Yeah, well, we as a rhetorical device to talk about our species and our civilization. And I mean, I think I was drawn to this subject originally by kind of frustration with the language we use to talk about it. We talk about global warming and, first of all, greenhouse effect, which of course is like a crazy, confusing way of talking about it, and climate change most recently. But of course, the globe is going to be fine, and the climate has changed dramatically in the past and will continue to change in millennia in the future. The problem is human civilization is not going to be fine, and we're talking about a threat to us. And so I think it's very disquieting to think that we all hold that we're all complicit in this to some extent, whether or not we are activists or deniers or anywhere in between. It's very uncomfortable to talk about a sense of moral responsibility, and yet I don't think it's honest to dismiss it entirely. I think especially if you live in America, I mean, you can be a homeless person in the U.S. burns more CO2 than the average global citizen. So I try to recycle as much as I can, and I have solar panels and things like that. But I took an airplane here today from New Orleans. Does that make me a hypocrite? Yeah, I guess so. I think we all are to some extent. And I think until we understand the issue in moral terms, and I don't think we have any chance of really coming up with any kind of, well, on one hand, I don't think we have any chance of talking about it honestly. On the other hand, I think it's also, when we talk about political solutions, I don't think unless you have a sense of moral engagement that they're possible. Which we can talk about more separately. But I think, people say, I wasn't born yet. It's like, sure, okay. Yes, technically you're right. I was, 5. And yet the point I'm trying to make is that there is some, that as long as our society engages in this, we are all responsible in the same way. I mean, I think of, I don't know, I mean, I hope this isn't too grand sounding, but I think of James Baldwin during the Civil Rights era saying, we all bear moral stain. And he's talking about himself too. Which is not to saying that like we should let the KKK off or sort of, racist politicians off the hook. Not at all. There's obviously gradations, but until we understand this as a universal problem for all of us that we all have a stake in, I think that any kind of honest conversation has to begin there.
So kind of going back to the first question of what motivated you to do this, and your comment that a lot of the articles seem to follow this similar pattern of here's the problem, here are the institutions that aren't acting. What do you hope this piece does to change the conversation, or where do you think the narrative needs to go to maybe see this issue differently and build some momentum again?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't write the piece with any to motivate any kind of political action, or I didn't write it from an activist perspective, which I think so much of the pieces about this subject are written from, which is, there's a problem. These people are making it worse. These people are making it better. These are some solutions. Let's not get too depressed. Here are some things you can do. Here are some people to vote for. I think that there's real value in that kind of work, and it's important, and it's valid and accurate. But I also think there is a deeper dimension to the problem that we haven't grappled with, and my hope was that by writing about this period, that we could ask some of these questions. And But I would never deign to say, like, I want this piece to have X and, some,
Right.
I think people can do with it what they want. If they want to use it and say, this is why we need to, vote for this candidate, great. If they want to say, this is why we'll never do anything, then I have no control over that either. And I've sort of, that's a conclusion I've drawn a long time ago about anything I write, is that you can't try to predict what people will make of it, but you can just try to tell the most honest story that you can.
I'm curious, you're in describing this, you're saying that people describe the problem and hear solutions, and yet, I don't know, I kind of feel that we don't hear enough about the solutions, that the news media is really focused on the problem. And there was actually a quote that really stuck out to me from one of the very early meetings, where a group of people got together to come up with policy recommendations, from Anthony Scoville, I think.
Yeah.
Saying, do we have a problem? We do, but it's not the atmospheric problem. It is the political problem. In a sense, we are making a transition not only in energy, but the economy as a whole. And you write, what if the problem was that they were thinking of it as a problem? And I really wonder, have we focused too much attention on defining this problem and precisely knowing its impacts and the uncertainty around it? Do we need to be focusing more of our writing on the good things that are happening? Because the news media are sort of a first filter of how people relate to the issue of climate change. And I think if you were to go out and survey the average person of what are the good things that are happening, you'll get some generic answers about maybe renewable energy, but we don't hear a lot about what are the efforts at local government level or at the state level or that private industry is doing.
Yeah, well, there's a big debate now within the activist community about how it's really a marketing question. How depressing should we be versus how optimistic? What's the best sales pitch? And I think they should be having that conversation. And I think that now it seems there's a kind of orthodoxy that has taken hold, that we're being too negative, so we have to be positive because there's some social science that says that if people get too bummed out, they tune out. Which, and you're the expert on this, my sense is that the social science is a lot more ambivalent about that question.
Maybe not about using fear and guilt. I think there's a pretty good consensus that when used on its own, and if we don't give people, if you use a fear appeal and don't match it with here are the things you can do that will truly address this thing that's causing the fear, people then shut down. And we kind of saw this after an Inconvenient Truth, that there was a lot of gloom and doom messaging that kind of backfired. So I feel that we know that by itself is not enough, but then there's this question of how do you maintain the urgency without overwhelming people, and how much hope do you have?
Right. I mean, I guess there's sort of several questions in there, and I feel like I'm probably not the person to answer any of them, but one is, what's the best activist message? My feeling is probably as many as possible, different ones. I don't know, but maybe if you were a political campaigner, there's probably more people who have better knowledge of how political campaigning should work.
I guess that I'm curious, not even from an advocacy role, but say the news media, they choose what to make into news. And is there a responsibility there to help show the more promising things that are happening with climate change?
I think there's a responsibility. Now, I'm not an editor or a publisher, but I think there's a responsibility, and I don't do daily journalism either, or cover the news, but I think there's a responsibility for everybody to be talking about it more, since I feel like it's the biggest existential threat we face as a species. So I think there's reason to talk about the good news, the bad news, the activism. I think it's morally reprehensible when in a presidential debate they don't ask about this issue. So I think there is a moral obligation to talk about it, and I think to understand it as part of the fabric of everything we do and everything we are. But if you're asking, the New York Times has a climate desk. Do they publish stuff about climate every day? Is that enough? That gets into other questions. I feel like all I can do is write stories that interest me, and try to do that as best as I can. But I think it's certainly valid to say that we don't hear enough about all aspects of this issue, given its significance and primacy in our future.
So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to student questions, or questions in general, but we'll start with students.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I have maybe it's a very simple question. I told my girlfriend that I was going to come here and see about the losing the earth piece. And now listening to you, why wasn't it the earth losing us? Like if the earth's gonna remain, did you thought about another title?
Yeah, it's not my title or subtitle. I had a different title that nobody liked. That I won't say because everyone thinks it's stupid. But I don't think there's I think that's, yeah, what would the title be then? Earth losing us?
Well, she studies like environmental policy, and she told me it's not that we are losing the earth, because the earth's gonna remain.
Yeah,
So
I agree. Yeah, she's right. She should talk to my editors, yeah.
Okay, so once again, thank you so much for your presentation. So I just wanted, I guess, more clarity. I haven't actually read through your entire piece, and I will, because I'm obviously interested now. But if it wasn't, I guess, Republican Party, and if it wasn't lobbying from oil and gas until after 1989, what do you think was like the critical thing that prevented us from getting like a global framework on climate change in that decade?
Right. So there is a narrow political answer, which is that after George H.W. Bush ran on solving the greenhouse effect and was under a lot of bipartisan pressure early in his term to do something, his chief of staff, John Sununu, former New Hampshire governor, and a PhD scientist, although in mechanical engineering, came to the conclusion that the science was phony, basically, that the climate models weren't accurate. And he further thought this was part, it's very hard to even describe because it's intellectually somewhat incoherent, but that it was part of a kind of series of environmental issues that had been used by kind of left-wing socialist ideologues to stop growth. So he got into this whole kind of conspiratorial thing, and he basically, and the piece tells a story, like single-handedly stopped the U.S. from signing a binding deal. He rallied a couple other administration folks to his side. He had a huge fight. He was hugely at odds with the EPA, head of EPA, William Riley, and Bush himself was kind of actually checked out of the issue for the most part. So that's the narrow political answer, but then it raises another question, which is, well, why did it take just one person within the administration to stop a global treaty, even a powerful person within the administration? And I think at the time you had public awareness of the issue. It was like, I think 2/3 of Americans wanted policy on climate change. And I think the answer is that, well, the support was broad but shallow, that it wasn't a priority. I mean, you can see that in the public opinion polls too. It's still like a low priority thing. And so it couldn't withstand even the slightest pushback politically. And that, I think, raises questions about basically how much importance we assign to the future. I think it raises questions about how much we really value welfare of future generations and what sacrifices we're willing to take for them. These were conversations also that were going on through the whole decade by economists, social scientists, political scientists, saying, taking climate change as a given and saying, well, is this a problem that human beings are even capable of solving using our systems of government, using democracy, using global bodies? And I think there was a lot of skepticism that it was solvable or that stringent enough remedies could be taken. I personally feel that there was a failure to summon a moral argument, to create a moral vision of the problem. So even then, even in 1988, 89, the incident that rallied all of this public support for a treaty was Jim Hansen standing up in the hottest day ever in Washington, D.C. and saying climate change is here now, and see, you can feel it because of the droughts, the wildfires, and so on, which is essentially an appeal to self-interest. And then what happened is that the fall came, and then the winter came, and then the next summer was not quite as hot. And if you're relying on basically apocalyptic conditions to rally the populace to change, you're going to be still waiting a lot longer. And so I feel like that there was a failure. They did everything they could. They didn't know, this is the same thing that had worked for other issues, this strategy. But I don't think with this problem that it was a good match. And I think to this day it's not a good match. I think there has to be a higher appeal. And the only person who's really made that appeal in public life is of a high stature is really the Pope in his encyclical a few years ago. But you haven't seen that kind of argument picked up by, leaders, moral authorities, and at least at a large enough scale, I think, to really bring people around.
Thank you so much for being here today. So, under this administration specifically, we have pretty much lost faith in its ability to fight out against climate change. And so what do you think the role of authority will be, both under this administration and in the future, of addressing climate change? Do you think it'll be at a city level? Do you think it'll be local authorities? Can we hold international institutions accountable to promoting change? And if we can't hold the president accountable, who can?
Well, so to zoom out, like the big picture is there are plans. Jim Hansen has a plan that's a 10-year plan that's very practical, that starts 2021, the year after Trump's first term ends, not by coincidence. And basically, like most plans, it's some combination of carbon taxes, major investment in renewable energy, investment in decarbonization and carbon extraction technology, which doesn't really exist yet. And crucial for Hansen is deep expansion of nuclear energy and sending nuclear technology all over the world so people can use it. There are other plans like his, and so the plans, the practical part of it is not really the issue anymore. There's also extremely strong economic arguments for why it's good for everybody to start doing this sooner than later. Maybe good for everyone except for like the coal industry. But even Hansen has an appeal. He thinks that like an Exxon is important partner in this because some of these giant conglomerates are big enough that if they pivoted hard towards renewable energy, it would have like a substantial effect. So the question is political will, and I think you have the will in a lot of other places in the world, and you have some places who attach it to a moral argument. You see it especially in sort of the low-lying islands. They've been making these moral arguments for years. And they understand that it has an existential threat. And I think, Rave Pomerance's theory, and this is sort of, now we're moving outside of my own expertise about the sort of geopolitics of it, but not that I'm an amateur all the way through. But yeah, Rave Pomerance, his point is that the U.S. Congress is the most important global body for climate change, and that if you get the U.S. Congress to push for it, make it a priority, the rest of the world, the president and the rest of the world will come with it. I think there's some merit to that argument. His way of doing that is by turning the Florida Republicans around, because that's sort of the weak part of the armor there, because they're living in the part of the country that's by far has the most to fear immediately from climate change. So it's possible, technically it's possible. Economically, it makes sense to keep warming under 1.5 degrees, and all you need is political momentum, and that's where I keep returning to this idea of a moral argument, and I think it'll get there. The question is how fast, how much warming is baked in by the time it turns.
So I want to ask about the strategy that people can use to counter denialists. Some people argue that if we pivot science as capital T truth, it doesn't work because people cannot see what is happening inside the laboratory. So there's an argument like we can actually pivot science as more a social enterprise. We should emphasize the network of scientists, the verifying, the complex institutional architecture that scientists are using, as opposed to the lack of it on the side of the denialist. So what do you think of this strategy? Like you talk about moral strategy, so what about the social strategy? Like making science more human and lay out what science is socially about.
Yeah, I mean, my heart goes out to the scientific community has done everything it can do. I mean, they are beleaguered and have tried everything and have spoken out. And even now, it's sort of unfashionable in a lot of scientific circles to talk about politics and so on. My feeling about all of that, I mean, I recently did an event at the Pulitzer Center in Missouri at the journalism school, and it was open to the public. And one of the hosts said to me ahead of time, well, this is open to the public, this is a red state, and you might get some people who are denialists, basically, not because of any sinister motives, but because that's what they've been fed by Fox News or what have you. And it's important to be careful in the way we talk about the issue in front of them. And I sort of feel like I don't care about that anymore. That we're not careful about, flat Earth, people who believe that the Earth is flat. When we write about any issues related to the shape of the planet, we don't say, well, some people think the Earth is flat. Their view, and they do. There are people. That is like a growing movement. We don't talk about Kyrie Irving leading the way, but we don't talk when we write about new developments in evolutionary biology. We don't say, well, some people think, that Earth was created by God 5,000 years ago. It's not part of the conversation. And in the same way, with this, I think we have to recognize that the whole denialism idea is something that came out of a very targeted propaganda campaign that was initiated in the early 90s, and the piece tells the story of how that developed originally, and plenty of other books go into much greater depth about it. So giving it I feel like almost giving it any oxygen gives it a stature that is undeserving. And I feel like if we start talking about this, when we talk about this in moral terms, some of the frivolous nonsense quickly falls away. And I think you see that with other major social issues. I think you see that, think about all the crazy science, fake hoax science that's been used to justify racism, to justify, male-female marriage to the exclusion of, or to attack homosexuality. Anytime we've had these major social issues and there have been great changes in kind of a collective will politically about it in society, there tends to be a strong moral argument that cuts through all of the nonsense. So I don't think the fault is with the scientists there. I think the responsibility is to speak about it honestly, and if people don't realize that this is settled science, you can help them, but I don't think we need to make too elaborate concessions to that, personally. But maybe the social scientists have a different view.
I'll jump in a little bit. I mean, I agree with you to not give oxygen to the idea of denialism, and there are far fewer people who deny climate change than you might think based on how it's portrayed in the media. A lot of that really is fed by various nefarious institutions who are funding internet trolls to go and also put comments out there suggesting it's not real. There are segments of the population, though, who have a knee-jerk reaction to climate change because the idea of it and what we need to do to address it threatens some part of their livelihood. So if you think about people in coal country or near tar sands. And there's some research suggesting that the best way to engage those communities is to have a frank and open conversation that starts with acknowledging, yes, we thought coal was a great thing. We thought oil was a great thing. We respect the role that your family played in bringing our country as far as we have, energy-wise, but it's now time to have a transition. And if you start the conversation with respect, that can sort of cut through that knee-jerk reaction and open up a conversation where it's easier for people to engage because they don't feel that they're being personally attacked.
Hi, thank you so much for this discussion. Well, I have a question from an international student perspective that I am. I've seen the climate change international politics is very well robust. We have seen our common future, the Brundtland Report, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the creation of the Green Climate Fund, and a lot of countries are doing a lot of stuff in climate change. So my question is like, why does the United States need, in order to jump into this already international politics, infrastructure, and climate change that we have built over the years?
Political leadership, a social movement that prioritizes it, and I mean, I don't know. Beyond that, that's it. The question is, how do you get there? And I think some level of mortal shame is part of the answer, and part of it might be, look at the rest of the world. They're doing this. But I think that an interesting parallel, though, gets into, is part of the way, like we talked about how activism here, there's this idea that we need to focus on being optimistic, and that's going to motivate people. I don't get the sense that a lot of, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't get the sense that a lot of nations who are most aggressive on this stuff, or most progressive on climate policy, are super optimistic. I don't feel like the Northern Europeans are especially optimistic, but that doesn't prevent them from taking much more powerful action. So I do think there's some value to be had in a kind of comparative politics of social movements. I mean, of course, each country has its own conditions and all of that. But it does, I think, I do question some of these sort of orthodoxies of the movements here when you see very different results reached in other parts of the world that don't follow the same prescriptions. But of course, there's no one right answer.
Question over here.
Thank you so much for being here. I think a lot of us probably read your article and found it really meaningful and shared it with a lot of people. So first of all, just thank you for writing it. It was incredible. One question I have is, we're at this great university, has billions of dollars in its endowment, is a member of the Ivy Plus Sustainability Consortium that your alma mater organized like a decade ago under Richard Levin. And it's by far the least ambitious university in terms of trying to minimize its own carbon footprint. So I think it's easy for us to be upset at folks in coal country, but then, we'll organize our weddings and buy 100 steak dinners and go to Thailand for a honeymoon and actually have more of a carbon impact. Like, how do you pressure people at places like the University of Chicago, these other institutions, people at McKinsey who agree that climate change is a problem and then take 200 first-class flights a year to actually take some ownership in reducing their own footprints and to be part of the solution, even if they're right thinking and vote the right way?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a version of the question that I think we all face, or anyone who cares about this issue or thinks about the issue faces every day. And you can drive yourself crazy. It's like every decision you make, there's probably some carbon footprint aspect to it. And yeah, how do you develop a pressure campaign to change university policy? I think the same way as you do with any other issue, you get enough people to demand it. But certainly it's not neat and clean, and certainly we're all going to be hypocrites at some level too, and we have to acknowledge that. But I would say, I think that some of these movements at universities have had huge amount of success, and often you've seen social movements begin in that kind of fashion. And I also feel like with this issue, which has this profound intergenerational aspect that we also never talk about, that you're going to see the change forced from younger people. I mean, you know, the climate change that we feel now is not based on your honeymoon to Thailand. It's come from warming that's been done by your ancestors. And for that matter, the CO2 forcing that you're causing with your flight to Thailand is not going to be felt for another, you know, couple decades by your children. So there's a kind of battle of generations, or we're paying for our parents' sins and so on. That is another thorny part of it. But certainly at some point, if things are let to get bad enough, the suffering will be high enough that you'll have some real, a more profound level of anger, but then it'll also be too late to avoid some pretty scary situations. So I do think, something needs to come sooner, and conventional ways of applying political pressure work with this just as with anything else.
I'll jump in there. I actually study how to change people's behavior. I would say there's sort of the same answer. You need some leadership there. As we say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There are a lot of people who mean to do well, but if you think about what it means to have a low carbon lifestyle, it means changing a lot of your habits. It may mean putting a lot of money up front to invest in an energy efficiency or a fuel efficient car. And it can be hard to follow through on that intention. So to the extent, from a policy perspective, that you can think about how to structure programs that help people follow through on that, to make it easy, to dangle incentives out there. And if you think about it in a university context, you could think about how can the university model desirable behaviors. If you can show these behaviors in a positive light that doesn't necessarily feel like sacrifice, I think that makes it easier for people to follow through.
I guess I would also just to add on, and you might disagree with this, but my approach would also be to really, you know, if you talk about industry, whatever the issue is, maybe it's divestment, say, as an example. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the most productive, no. But whatever it is, I think we're done with speaking of it in terms of you're doing something because a donor gave you money or you have this political reason, and I think we need to talk about it as what you're doing is harming our future, and you're harming the future welfare of generations of people to come, and to understand that as the truth, which it is, and to speak about it in those terms. And I think once you are clear about the stakes of the issue, the moral argument comes along with it.
Hi, thank you so much. This was very informative. On the issue of motivation, if I'm not mistaken, back in the 70s to late 70s timeframe, there was a huge push for clean synthetic fuels because the fossil fuels industry thought we were running out of petroleum.
Yeah.
Which is not at all the case, but that led to converting coal to synthetic fuels and purification of all the emissions that contribute to the greenhouse effects. So that's part of this history, and I was wondering what your thoughts are in terms of on the motivation issue. I do agree with the moral stance and the Laudato side for sure. But economic push may help as well.
Yeah, the beginning of this story is playing out right during a debate that's taking place within the Carter administration about synthetic fuels, which were understood at the time to be horribly, dirty, high emission. But this was part of an effort by the administration to be energy independent. This is in the trauma of the Middle Eastern oil crises, and so Carter had a solar energy plan and he had a synthetic fuels plan. And Rave Pomerance, a lot of the first arguments, conversations that were being held, including with Carter's science advisor, Frank Press, who's another of this esteemed generation of sort of nuclear scientists, was the architect of the synthetic fuel program under Carter. And so he was sympathetic to the argument that we have to stop producing CO2 on one hand. On the other hand, they felt there was this economic incentive and sort of national security value of developing, basically turning coal into gasoline. That ended up not happening, but some of the first conversations about global warming were held around congressional debate over whether to go forward with a synthetic fuel initiative. Because at the very beginning, people in the late 70s were saying, well, wait a minute, there's also this issue with CO2 if we go through with this.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions. There's one over here.
Hi, thank you for being here today. So in today's conversation, you've talked a bit about like individuals being reprehensible and institutions being reprehensible. And what I'm wondering is if that extends to the whole structure of society in some ways. And what I mean by that is the United States is a capitalist democracy. If we think of all of government as a massive institution and all of the economy as a massive institution, when people are incentivized to preserve their jobs or accumulate wealth, does the structure of a capitalist democracy in some ways inhibit a solution to this problem?
Yeah, so that's sort of the Naomi Klein argument that our whole economic system is at odds with the goal of reducing emissions, or our whole economic system, the other way of looking at it, is based on extraction. And there's something to be said to that. I mean, that's William Nordhaus, who just won the Nobel Prize. Basically his invention or his work on the carbon tax was a remedy to that. And it was saying that the problem isn't that we're seeking profit so we have to extract, it's that we're not accurately pricing carbon, which has this huge cost, but we're getting it for free. And so that's the remedy, and there are other, and it's like other remedies we use, except this problem is just the time scale is so much larger and the effects are, and it's so much more consequential. Is the answer, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that argument. I'm not also convinced, and at a certain point I wonder if it's irrelevant, because the time scale that we need in which change has to happen is not the time scale in which the US is going to, capitalism is going to be overthrown, I don't think. But there are remedies to that take into account this weakness of our system, and it has been shown to work.
So one final question. I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate everything that's been said here in the questions. I grew up in Hyde Park, and I remember that during the 50s and later on in the 60s, there were movements that existed here on campus and elsewhere against nuclear war, against the bomb, the Manhattan Project, for example. And also, I think that nuclear war and nuclear weapons are the same kind of existential problem we have. Those are the 2 things that can destroy the species. The rest of it, all the other things, feed the hungry, whatever, we'll figure out. But if we don't survive, we'll never get a chance to. So somehow we have to convince the American people, to convince Congress, that it's not about a suffering that we need to go through. I would reframe that as an investment in the future, and even for a better present, by knowing that we're doing everything we can to make the planet better, not only for ourselves, but for this generation and their future generations.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good articulation of sort of the long lost conservative argument for environmental policy, and it was one that was made as recently as the 1980s by conservatives, by Republicans, that We should be, just as we shouldn't, base our entire financial plan on the next quarter, we shouldn't base our entire economy on the next 5 years, what have you. Nobody makes that argument in the current Republican Party anymore that I'm aware of. They say climate change isn't real. But I think that argument still has some merit. And the other thing I would add is that global warming is not going to hurt us because we're going to incinerate, right? At a certain point, the two existential crises meet, right? We have, what we're talking about is hundreds of millions of people who become refugees and have to move from Bangladesh to India, move from coastal China inland, move from South America and Central America to the North America, and major geopolitical stability and major shortage of resources and availability of drinking water and food, and that then puts an incredible amount of pressure on our political systems, and a lot of our major countries have nuclear bombs. So I think that's another way of, an honest understanding of the global warming problem is to understand it is a nuclear war problem. And that's where we'll feel it, I think, first, before we get to a totally uninhabitable planet if the worst case scenario plays out.
I had wanted to end on hope, but maybe not. If you could all join me in thanking Nathaniel Rich for being here with us tonight.